Well, today we are going to talk about Israel, another difficult subject for many reasons, and of course, a kind of controversial subject as well. So I'm going to try to give you just sort of the outlines of the history. And, we'll probably have some time to discuss some of the more controversial aspects. Today's big questions. What ancient and modern influences spurred Zionism? Because today, if we're going to talk about Israel, of course, we're going to have to talk about Zionism and the desire for a Jewish homeland. Zionism is not necessarily a bad word. It's become a word that is used as an insult sometimes, but Zionism means a need for a Jewish homeland. How was the modern state of Israel formed? And how did Israel's current geopolitical situation develop? It's very different, has really changed over the last few years. And what is noteworthy about Israel besides its geopolitical circumstances? Now, I'd like you to put in the chat some associations you have, words, phrases, thoughts, songs, prayers that say something about your relationship to Israel or just your thinking about Israel. Okay, so let's just take a moment to do that. What comes to mind when you think of the word Israel? Land, our land, a safe haven, a Jewish state, archaeology, aliyah, aliyah means moving there, sacred, kibbutz, history, Mossad, Mossad being the intelligence service, diverse, a community of Jews, archaeology as well. Yeah. Christina is not on, but she would certainly say archaeology since that's what she's studying and doing over there. Golda Meir. By the way, the wall, we'll talk about the wall, the Holy Land. Of course, holy for several different religions, right? Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. By the way, the kibbutz was, of course, very important in the beginning, but it's now a very small part of Israeli society. And many kibbutzim, that's the plural, now are basically enterprises, like they have factories or they have hotels or whatever. They're more capitalistic enterprises than what they used to be. Yeah. Okay, great. Those are great things to put on there. How big is Israel? So take a look at this, because there's a lot of controversy around Israel. There's a lot of boycotting of Israel and targeting Israel. Look how big Israel is in relation just to California. A tiny sliver, right? You might think Israel was a big country given everything that's been going on with Israel. Here's Israel in the context of its neighborhood, or even larger than its own neighbors. See how teensy, it's a teeny little tiny thing there. All the fighting over it, and all the, slandering of the country and whatever. I mean, it is really so small. And there we are. If we look at the entire world, that's where Israel is. Anybody know what continent it's on?
Asia.
Correct. Thank you. Okay. So what does Israel actually mean, the word itself? So it can mean the people of Israel, Jews in general, or the state of Israel. So why would it mean the people of Israel? We are B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel. So who is Israel if we're the children of Israel? Anybody know?
One of the patriarchs.
One of the patriarchs. What was his name before it was Israel?
Jacob.
Jacob, good, good. So Jacob was wrestling in the middle of the night with some ish in Hebrew, which means man. We don't really know if was it an angel, was it a man, was it his conscience? He's wrestling, and in the morning, he's told your name is now going to be changed to Israel. Anybody know what Israel means? We've mentioned this before.
One who contends with God.
One who contends with God. Very nice. So he's in some sort of struggle with a divine being, or we're not sure. It's not clear, in the text. But it means to contend with God. And that's what the Ish tells him at the end, you contended with God and prevailed. So this is really essential. We are not people who click our heels and say, yes, God, whatever you say. We contend with God. We argue with God, right? We argue with each other. That's what we're about, you know. As I've said before, the questions are more important than the answers. So we're the children of Israel. And so when you say Israel, it could mean the people. If you want to refer to the state of Israel in Hebrew, it's Medinat Israel. But if you just use the word Israel itself, it's not clear. Do you mean the country? Do you mean the land? Do you mean the people? So here's where we start in the Bible. So God says to Abram, remember his name was Abram before it was Abraham. When he finally has a brit, a covenant with God, his name has changed. But right now, at the very beginning, it's Abram. God says, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. Abram went forth as God commanded him. In this case, he does listen to what God says, but in other cases, he argues. And they set out for the land of Canaan. When they arrived in Canaan, Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem at the terebinth of Moreh. The Canaanites were then in the land. God appeared to Abram and said, I will assign this land to your offspring. So the land of Canaan is what then became Israel. And the land of Israel is very, very important to Jews. This is just from, you know, a medieval writer, Yehuda Halevi. And it's the longing for Zion, another name for Israel. The longing is always there because, of course, we were kicked out of the land after the Romans took over. And so here's my heart is in the east and I in the far off west. How can I find an appetite for food? How shall it be pleasing to me? How shall I render my vows and my bonds while Zion lies beneath the fetter of Edom? Edom is Rome. And I in Arab chains. So he's over in Spain, which is ruled by one of the Arab dynasties. It would seem to me easy to leave all the good things of Spain as the dust and destruction of the sanctuary has become precious to my eyes. That's the destruction of the temple, which I mentioned before. You know, there's also Psalms like by the rivers of Babylon. That was an earlier Psalm talking about the exile in Babylon. So there's always this, you know, longing to return. And as I mentioned a couple of times ago, an independent state existed way back under King David and Solomon, and then for 100 years under the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, and that was before the Common Era. So it took another, you know, 1,000 and almost 2,000 years to come back to the land of Israel as an independent state. So the birth of Zionism, how did this all start? Well, part of it was a zeitgeist, right? There was a lot of nationalistic kind of fervor going on in this period of time in history, but very specifically for Zionism. So Theodor Herzl was a playwright and a journalist. Apparently he wasn't a great playwright. And he grew up in Austria. He was from a very assimilated family and never gave that much thought to the whole business of Zionism or you know, Israel or whatever. Well, until he went to France to cover the trial of Dreyfus, Alfred Dreyfus, who was a captain in the French army and who was accused of being a traitor. It was a trumped up charge, not at all a true thing. But not only was he, you know, brought before the court, he also, I mean, the crowds were just, you know, saying horrible things about Jews to the point where Émile Zola, a French novelist, wrote this very famous letter called J'accuse, which means I accuse, about how awful this anti-Semitism was. And this is really what turned Herzl around and said, oh dear, this is, you know, not possible. We're not going to ever be able to be accepted. So he decided that it was absolutely imperative for a Jewish homeland to be created. And this is, you know, not that there was not some kind of desire for returning, some kind of Zionistic, you know, desire beforehand, but Herzl is the one who really galvanized people around this idea. And this is called political Zionism. So it's about creating a homeland. There were other forms of Zionism, for example, labor Zionism, the idea that, Jews had been historically, in these yeshivas studying, of course, men, studying and pale-faced and weak. I mean, they never were allowed to own land and work on the land, but that's who they were. And now they need to go into this land and really work it and be a really strong person. And you see posters then of men with tractors, Jewish men with tractors, not a typical image. Or you have cultural Zionism, which is about we need to create our culture, and that's what's important. Ahad Ha'am is one person who promoted that idea. He wasn't so sure about having an actual state because he was worried about how power corrupts, and we know how that happens. So this is what Herzl wrote, a book called Judenstaat, which is the German for Jewish state. And here's what he wrote. No one can deny the gravity of the situation of the Jews. Wherever they live in perceptible numbers, they are more or less persecuted. Now, this is, of course, before there was such a thing as, the United States and Canada, where Jews have done quite well, because it was the very early days of these countries, and, they weren't flourishing the way they've flourished since then. All he sees in Europe is incredible anti-Semitism, and particularly, as I said, this trial in France. By the way, Dreyfus was eventually exonerated after being sent to Devil's Island. So they're persecuted no matter where we go. Their equality before the law granted by statute has become practically a dead letter. I mean, this is after emancipation, right? But as I said last time, emancipation was not always greeted with great glee by people who weren't Jewish, because either Jews were not assimilated enough or they were too assimilated. Either way, they were guilty of some bad thing that they had to be eliminated out of the country. So they are debarred from filling even moderately high positions, either in the army or in any public or private capacity. And attempts are made to thrust them out of business also. Don't buy from Jews. I merely wanted to indicate clearly how futile had been past attempts, most of them well-intentioned, to solve the Jewish question. Neither a diversion of the stream nor an artificial depression of the intellectual level of our proletariat will overcome the difficulty. The supposed infallible expedient of assimilation has already been dealt with. As I said, they tried to assimilate. They were given the rights of citizenship. Didn't make it any better. And this is before World War II, by the way. We cannot get the better of anti-Semitism by any of these methods. The Jews who wish for a state will have it. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our own homes. He had a very famous quote, if you will it, it is not a fantasy or whatever, and it was made into a song. And he really believed that a Jewish state was possible. Very unfortunately, this didn't happen in his lifetime, but he did all the groundwork to make it possible. Now, interestingly, here are a couple of problems already. So Israel Zangwill, who was a British Zionist, said, Palestine is a country without a people. The Jews are a people without a country. Very problematic statement. He did change his mind later about it, but the idea was, a land without a people for a people without a land. Well, guess what? There were people living there, okay? There was not. Now, I highly recommend a book by Ari Shavit called My Promised Land. He's had his own share of the Me Too movement, this particular writer, but the book is excellent. And it's a very personal look at how the state of Israel was created. And his great-grandfather gets there and, again, they don't notice that there are Arabs living there. It's not like they're just part of the, scenery. They actually live there. So, that was sort of a little seed of what was going to become a big problem later. So Palestine proper has already its inhabitants, the Pashalik. The Pashalik are the Turkish authorities. the domain of Turkish people. The Pashalik of Jerusalem is already twice as thickly populated as the United States, leaving Zionists a choice of driving the Arabs out or dealing with a large alien population. So you see in a few years, he very much changed his mind. And, you know, what do you do about the people who are already living there? Do you drive them out or do you find some way to live with them? Now, he moved his support to the Uganda scheme. So there was this crazy idea that rather than having the Jews go to Palestine, which we'll find out why it's called Palestine and what was going on there, but rather than having the Jews go there, let's go to Uganda and give them some land in Uganda, because that way they don't have to deal with the Arabs. Well, I think there are people who are also living in Uganda, but nonetheless, this was an idea for a brief time. It was eventually rejected. So the reason it's called Palestine, I may have mentioned this earlier, is that when the Romans took over, they changed the name. It was Judea at the time, because that was the area that was left, the southern country of Judea. They just changed it to Palestine because of the Philistines, who had been on the edges of the country. And it was insulting to call it Palestine, basically, you know, wiping out the fact that it had anything to do with Jews. And we'll find out that the British were ruling at this time. So here's how it happens. Okay, World War I. So you probably know a little bit this from your history classes, but the Ottoman Empire had been ruling over this area, especially where Israel now is. And the World War I basically ended the Ottoman Empire's hold on this area. And the great powers, Britain and France, decided, let's divide up all these countries. And they were somewhat arbitrary, you know, divisions. It wasn't like, oh, well, there's a tribe of people who lives here, we should keep them all together in one country. No, let's just slice and dice. And I think part of that was also to keep them from, you know, working together to oppose the colonialism of Britain and France. But they basically, you know, took over different parts of this area. And Britain took over the area that contained Palestine. And so in 1917, there's a Balfour Declaration, which we'll talk about in a moment. Here's just the way the land was divided. Lebanon was under France, as was Syria. Iraq and Transjordan and Palestine were all under the British mandate. And here is the Balfour Declaration. So Lord Balfour, who was the prime minister at the time, wrote to Lord Rothschild, an important Jewish leader. He says, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. So with all the efforts being made to create a state in Israel, the Brits said, okay, we'll give you a state. No problem. Didn't last long, but that's how they began. So here's how they had talked about dividing up the land. So initially, there was this idea of a very large land here for Palestine, or for what would eventually become Israel. But then it was this. Jewish Palestine would be this area. And then this eventually becomes the country of Jordan and whatever. So that was the initial idea behind the Balfour Declaration and the British Mandate for Palestine. And the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations, approved this division. So here's what mandatory Palestine was, what the agreement was. Oh, Nate raised his hand. Nate, go ahead.
I was just curious, what was the sort of like the justification on the British side for supporting a Jewish state? Like, I find it hard pressed to believe that they acted entirely out of wanting to help the Jewish people.
Yeah, I don't think it was to help, but I think they were getting a lot of pressure. I would imagine that people like Rothschild, who were wealthy, had some influence on that. This is before they kind of realized, the Arabs aren't too happy with this. So as I said, this didn't last very long. But, there was this issue of, the problem with Jews and what are we going to do? And, and there was a lot of agitation going on. I mean, there were Jews living at the time in Palestine. It's not like there were no Jews living there. There were Jews living there, agitating for a state, and Jews in the rest of the world agitating for a state. So, and they were in charge of dealing with this, and they didn't really want to have a lot of unrest going on. Because the Ottoman Empire had been actually pretty welcoming of Jews. And so there were several aliyot, they're called, which are immigrations to Israel. And so there were a fair number of Jews that were already living there. Here's one of the reasons the British wanted to give a state to Jews. I'll share my PowerPoint. So the British government hoped that the declaration would rally Jewish opinion, especially in the United States, to the side of the Allied powers against the Central Powers during World War I. They also hoped that the settlement in Palestine of a pro-British Jewish population might help to protect the approaches to the Suez Canal in neighboring Egypt and thus ensure a vital communication route to British colonial possessions in India. So this is right before World War I, and the British thought that this would help their cause. And I'm sure there are other reasons as well. If people want to jump in, I'd be happy to hear other thoughts.
At the time of the Balfour Declaration, there was also a lot of Christian Zionism, idea that Jews going to, first of all, it solved the Jewish problem or the Jewish question in Britain, where there was a lot of anti-Semitism, but it also has significance in Christian theology that it would herald Armageddon and kind of the end, like the second coming in Christian theology. So both factors, theologically as well as politically, there was significant support in Britain for creating the state of Israel, not necessarily in support of Jews on their own sake, but more for British purposes, if that makes sense.
Doug?
Oh, I was just going to say an interesting part, if you look at that map, actually goes back to this whole concept of Gaza. When everything was originally proposed from the Balfour Declaration, as well as the other discussions, this entire connection between Gaza and what would eventually be the West Bank, or is the West Bank, that connection is critical, because the British demanded that there be a link between Gaza and the West Bank through what is now some of the most, where you usually find torpedoes or when you usually find missiles launching into Israel, is this particular strip that is outside of the Gaza Strip, that is the connection zone, and was one of the first things that was proposed as a necessity to maintain Palestine having a link to the ocean from a transport connection, because it was already lost in the north. Because Haifa was never going to be considered part of an Arab state or a Palestinian component, even though it was up against towards Lebanon. It was entirely in the south. The Jewish landholders would then eventually say, between Israel and Judea, which one should belong to which, and that's why this strip down there in the south was also important.
Yeah, and one of the problems.
But the British were obsessed with that.
One of the problems with creating a Palestinian state is that there is no connection right now between Gaza and the West Bank. And now with this mandatory Palestine idea, they would let 250,000 Jews emigrate from Europe. Western European Jews, of course, wanted to go because things were getting heated up in places like Germany. But right away, as soon as there was this proposal to create mandatory Palestine, the Arab riots started in various cities. Meantime, there's war brewing in Europe. And then the Brits said, you know what? The Arabs are in charge of oil. So, and especially if there's going to be a war, we're really going to need to get this oil. So maybe we need to modify this plan, right? But the British mandate, which, as I said, was approved by the League of Nations, lays down the Jewish legal right to settle anywhere in Western Palestine between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And it was approved in 1922. Here are problems. Tensions are rising among British rulers, Arabs, and Jews. So, as I said, the Jews in Palestine were not so happy to have the Brits occupying it and deciding what they're allowed to do or not to do and how many Jews are allowed to emigrate. So you have that problem. Then you have the Arabs revolting against the idea of more Jews immigrating and the problem of, taking land or becoming a country at some point. So the Brits, who are trying to keep the, quiet in this land, end up killing all these Arabs. And Jews were killed also by Arabs, also by Brits. Jews are also put in prison for, trying to get the Brits out of there. And they organize the Haganah, the Irgun, the Stern Gang. These are all defense groups. And they, bomb things and try to sneak in Jews and doing all kinds of things that are not what the Brits really want them to do. So then the Brits put out a white paper in 1939, which now limits the quota of how many Jews can immigrate to Palestine. So only 75,000 Jews over 5 years. Restriction of Jewish right to buy land from the Arabs. And after 1944, Jewish immigration would depend on Arab permission. And establishment of a Palestinian state within 10 years governed jointly by Jews and Arabs. So you can just imagine how well that would maybe work. However, believe it or not, right now, that is a proposal that's been made by a number of people, is that rather than trying to create 2 states, one that's Jewish and one that's an Arab state, people like Peter Beinart, who's a fairly well-known journalist, have said the only solution is a 1-state solution with joint government, which I have to tell you, I do not support that at all, because Jews who've lived in Arab countries have not been treated so well. I can't imagine that this would change right now. But you see now Jews are demonstrating against this white paper. The British white paper excluded the area east of the Jordan. So the West Bank would be part of where Jews were allowed to come in. And again, it should be neither Jewish nor Arab, but be an independent state. So that's where we are on the verge of World War II. So as we did last time, we found out that, yeah, there is genocide going on in Europe. We covered the Holocaust. It was really awful. And then even after the Holocaust, you had all these displaced people, right? The people in displaced people's camp, because where were they supposed to go? They no longer had a home, right? So now the world is feeling incredibly guilty. We really, really need to do something about this problem. Like 6 million Jews were killed, not to mention other people who were killed as well. It is really at the top of the list of what needs to be dealt with. So now there's a partition plan that's the UN comes up with. The blue is the Jewish state, and the orange is the Arab state, including the Gaza Strip. And the pink is the international zone, which I think makes a lot of sense.
Just a quick note, something that helps contextualize why there was so much conflict in such a brief period of time is that the Jewish population was less than 10% in 1917. So they have, then as soon as the Balfour Declaration happened, then there's this flooding of Jews into Palestine. So, and that's something that a lot of people tend to gloss over, is just how small the Jewish population was in Palestine for up until this period of time. And then there was a massive inflow of Jews, and then all of the complications that came up as a result of it.
Yes, and in the beginning, actually, I think the Jews and the Arabs got along fairly decently. It's just when more and more Jews were coming in and there was this like notion that, oh, it's going to become a country, that kind of changed the relationship between them. Okay, Christine?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. I was just wondering, who was permitted to participate in the discussions around the white paper and the earlier Balfour Declaration? I mean, were there Arab consultations
Okay, she just froze.
at all? And who were the Jews who were involved? Because this is like, seems critical to me. I mean, not names, but you know, who was included, who was excluded,
Right.
and was settlement colonization always part of the plan?
You know what? I doubt that any Arabs were consulted, but
I doubt it too.
Yeah, if somebody knows the answer to that. I don't know who was involved in those negotiations.
You know, it's on that one, that was a big issue because
Yeah,
there wasn't a component of consultation. Instead,
Exactly.
the focus really was on placement and replacement. Because previous to this, for the most part, the Jews who were living in Palestine, there was a high level of people, for the most part, were getting along. The biggest issue really came up when there was discussion over what was the sand dunes that would eventually become Tel Aviv. There was a discussion even before the Balfour Declaration of, well, if we can have the sand dunes, we'll go ahead and build a Jewish city. And that was where things started to get, whoa, wait a second.
Yeah.
We're all together.
Yeah. According to Stanley Diamond, who was in one of the kibbutzes because he got McCarthy'd and couldn't get a job here, so he went to work in Israel. But he and his family were in one of the far-flung border-ish areas. And he said that a critical issue that happened between the sort of coexistence in a kind of nebulous way between the Arab villages and the new kibbutzes was when there was a labor crisis. There weren't enough people to work the land who were Jewish. And so you started with this notion that you needed to restrict the Arab lands in order to develop a labor supply. And he saw this going on in the early to mid 50s when he was over there. And he hung out also in one of the Arab villages quite a bit. And they were keenly aware of what was going on to make them into basically a labor supply with no choice.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Any other comments? Okay, let's go on to the next thing. All right, so, you know, the birth of the state of Israel happened after the Jews in Israel fought against the British. And the British finally said, you know, we're done with this. Like, we don't want to rule this land anymore. It's too much of a mess. There's too much conflict, and we're leaving. And so on May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, who became the first prime minister, declared the state as an independent state, finally. Oops, I didn't want to go. Okay, I don't want to read that yet. Hello. So you can actually go to Tel Aviv and enter this hall where this all happened. And actually, when I did it, the tour was fabulous. It really made you feel like you were sitting right there. And by the way, this is on the left. What you see here on the left is the declaration signed by a whole bunch of people. This is the whole thing. And by the way, Israel does not have a constitution. So it's like, this is it, really, except for a few basic laws. Okay, we have a question or a comment from?
I was just putting that in there from the previous discussion for reading material that people can look into.
Rashid Khalid's The Iron Cage discusses the Palestinian perspective on this issue and dives into the representation of Palestinians or lack thereof in the Balfour Declaration and the establishment of the State of Israel. Thank you. So where the establishment of the State of Israel was this amazing thing, I mean, you know, Jews all over the world celebrated it. It was just this amazing moment. For the Arabs, this was called the Nakba, the disaster. But let's look at what the Declaration says. The state of Israel will be open to the immigration of Jews and for the ingathering of the exiles from all countries of their dispersion. Will promote the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. Will be based on the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace as envisaged. I don't know who wrote that up. You know what? Why do I rely on the URJ? They make mistakes. Okay, that's not the way you spell that word. By the prophets of Israel, will uphold the full social and political equality of all its citizens without distinction of race, creed, or sex, will guarantee full freedom of conscience, worship, education, and culture, will safeguard the sanctity and inviolability of the shrines and holy places of all religions, and will dedicate itself to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. So everybody is supposed to have equal rights, Arab, Jew, Christian, secular person. So let's look at David Ben-Gurion, a very distinctive face and hair. He was originally born in Poland. He's the leader of the labor Zionist movement. And he was the national founder of the State of Israel, its first prime minister, the preeminent leader of the Jewish community in British Mandate Palestine from 1935 until the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, which he led until 1963. So as I mentioned, the birth of the modern state of Israel is considered the Nakba by the Palestinians. And what you see here is, see, the minute the state of Israel was declared, the Arab states, now this is the thing that nobody ever talks about, and it really drives me crazy. The Arab states around there, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, the whole bit, Lebanon, I mean, all these states around attacked Israel. Like, we are not allowing this state to exist, okay? So they attack, and guess what? At the end of it, the state of Israel is bigger than it was before because the Jews got more territory. An armistice is signed in 1949, but that does not mean that the Arab countries are okay with this state. But just look at this evolution of the state and how eventually the Israeli army gets this much larger territory. I mean, I get that this is considered, quote, a settlement colonial enterprise, right? So you get Europeans, because the Jews were Europeans, coming in and taking land. But it was supposed to be some sort of equal distribution of land. The UN approved it. There were lots of countries that were part of the UN at this point. And the minute that the country of Israel was declared, you get the Arab states coming down on them, trying to destroy the state. And as I said, Israel gets more land. Well, thank you very much, Arab states, for taking land away that would have been a Palestinian country, right? Now, during this war, what happens is there were some Arab or Palestinians who were forced to leave by the Israelis. Part of the problem was there was a war going on and the Palestinians didn't want these Jews there. But they were forced out and there were some massacres. There's no question about that. At the same time, the Arab countries were telling the Palestinians, leave, we're going to take this back. You will be able to return very soon. So, and some of them left of their own. So there were various reasons why the Arab refugees left. As I said, the Arab countries said, you can leave, don't worry about it, we'll get it back for you momentarily. Some of them just left because they were scared or didn't want to be around during this period of time. what happens right here? The Jordan, country of Jordan, takes the West Bank, which was supposed to be part of the Palestinian state. So when people complain about Jews taking over land that was supposed to go to the Palestinians, Jordan took this land. And what did they do during the time they had this land? Did they make the Palestinians citizens? No, they kept them as refugees. And by keeping them as refugees, they problematized the whole question of Israel by saying, hey, look, Israel became a country. Look at these people living in refugee camps. Egypt took Gaza. Okay, so the Arab countries that took this land did not create a state for the Palestinians, did not make them citizens of their country. They kept them in refugee camps. No one ever talks about that when they talk about Israel as being this monstrous country taking land away from the Palestinians, not allowing them to have a state. I'm not saying Israel is blameless, we'll go into that, but this is really important to know as well. Really important. Yeah, Sasha Ross put Mark Tesler's History of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict as a reference, which I completely agree with. It is an excellent, excellent book. And Ilan Pape's History of Modern Palestine, One Land, Two Peoples, both very important, yes. My Promised Land is more of a personal journey, but it covers a lot of the issues that are relevant today. So now you got all these refugees. They're still refugees. There still are refugees there. I just want everyone to remember that. So here's what Benny Morris, who's also a very well-known historian, says. He talks of frightened communities fleeing their homes at the first whiff of grape shot as they or neighboring villages were attacked, of communities expelled by conquering Israeli troops, of villages ordered by Arab commanders to send away women, children, and the old to safety in inland areas, and of economic privation, unemployment, and general chaos as the British Mandate government wound down and allowed the two native communities to slug it out. The better organized, economically more robust, and ideologically more cohesive and motivated Jewish community weathered the flail of war. Palestinian society fell apart. So indeed, there were several reasons for the Arab population to leave. It wasn't all of them, but it was some of them. And it's a continuing problem today in terms of trying to figure out if it's possible to even create two states at this point. Meantime, in Arab countries, guess what happened? Jews were expelled. Actually, almost 1 million Jews were expelled from these countries. And you see here the percentages. It is very, very hard to read. So when I send it to you, you'll be able to read it better. These are considered Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews. So Sephardic Jews are Jews who were originally in Spain. When they were kicked out of Spain, they went to various places, Holland, the Americas, and some of these countries here. So Sephardic Jews are specifically Jews whose origin is from Spain. Mizrahi Jews, Mizrahi means east. It's the Jews from all of these Arab countries. And frankly, when they got to Israel, they weren't treated so well because Israel was really founded by labor Zionists, socialists to a great extent, from the Ashkenazi world, Poland, Germany, those kinds of places. And very unfortunately, the Jews from these Arab lands were not treated so well. They were considered sort of second class. They were much more religious. They were more sort of ethnic. They were poorer, and they were darker. I don't know, somehow dark means you're going to be mistreated. So you see from all of these Arab countries, the number of Jews that were expelled or treated so badly that they really had to leave. 265,000 from Morocco, 140,000 from Algeria, Libya. You see all these numbers. And now there are very, very few Jews living in those countries, if any at all. So from the very beginning, as you saw, the minute there was a state of Israel, they were attacked by Arab countries. But those Arab countries didn't give up. In 1967, they waged what is known as the Six-Day War. It only lasted for 6 days. And amazingly enough, against all of these Arab enemies, Israel was able to prevail, unbelievably. I mean, Israel, as you saw, is a teensy little country. So here's what some of these Arab countries said about Israel. Strike the enemy's civilian settlements, turn them into dust, and pave the Arab roads with the skulls of Jews. This is from the Iraqi defense minister. Arab masses, this is your day. Rush to the battlefield. Let them know that we shall hang the last imperialist soldier with the entrails of the last Zionist. Damascus radio. The Zionist barracks in Palestine is about to be collapsed and destroyed. Every Arab has been living in the past 19 years with one hope, to see the day Israel is liquidated. That's from Cairo. There will be practically no Jewish survivors. Palestine Liberation Organization Chairman Ahmed Shukeri. And our basic objective will be to destroy Israel. Thank you from the Egyptian president, Nasser. So you see that they just wanted to crush Israel, but they were unsuccessful. And what happened as a result of this? Now Israel controls the West Bank of the Jordan, which used to be part of Jordan, the Golan Heights, part of Syria, and the Sinai Desert, which was part of Egypt, and also Gaza. So now Israel is in control of these areas that are the most problematic areas are going to be the West Bank and Gaza, now under Israeli control. But now for the first time, Jerusalem is right on the edge of the West Bank. They're able to get into the part of Jerusalem that they were never able to get near, which included the Western Wall. I think I'm going to stop here before going on and just see if there are any questions or, oh, Christine, go ahead.
One of my friends who is, well, now she's in exile in Egypt, she's Palestinian, and she viciously blames Lebanon and some of the surrounding Arab countries for creating an intolerable situation for families like hers who were just living there and actually figuring out ways of living there with the other communities. And they were forced into exile by Lebanon. And she had to grow up in a refugee camp. It was, so there are Palestinians who really recognize that the complications of what went on for all of that. And, but they're not listened to. They're not listened to. I actually had a question though. When was it, since it really didn't seem to be the case from the very beginning, but when did this sort of religious right thing happen where at first, at least part of Israel was secularized, right? And it was the labor Zionists.
Yes, it was a very secular country when it was first, because, okay.
So was the rightward swing after the 6-Day War, or
no,
what happened?
This is what happened. Ben-Gurion gave the religious, fundamentalists the right to do the things that we talked about, like that if you want to get married, you have to get married through a rabbi, and the rabbi has to be Orthodox. Okay. He thought they were going to die out. Guess what happened? They didn't die out. Okay. Now, the other thing is that Israel is, the government is a parliamentary system, right? The Knesset is a parliamentary system. There are 120 seats in the Knesset. In order to have a majority, you have to have 61 people on your side.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, in the latest election, I think the Likud got 32 seats, something like that. So that's not enough to form a majority coalition where you can get anything passed, right? So what you have to do is form a coalition with other parties. What parties do you choose? Well, if you're the Likud, which is fairly conservative and right-wing, you're going to pick the religious parties, Shas, United Torah, those parties, okay? And those parties are going to say, okay, if you want us, there's certain lines you can't cross, like you can't force us to go into the army, or you can't take away from us the right to do marriages and funerals, right? Right now, what Netanyahu is trying to do, he's working both ends, because he brought in a guy who's a Kahanist, who is a follower of Meir Kahane, who is a very, very right-wing racist, and his party was actually kicked out of the Knesset. So he's got this guy, Ben Zvi, I think his name is. Zvi something, I have to look it up. Anyway, so we brought him in, but he's also working with one of the Arab Knesset members, and pulled him away from because there's a group of Arab parties that have coalesced into one group. And so he's trying to get them as well. And this guy's thinking to himself, well, you know, if I join, then maybe I'll get money for my people. And, you know, is that worth it to also give up on just being against the whole idea of Zionism? So he's working both ends right now, the far right. And I mean, the Arab parties are usually considered to be left, but this guy, you know, is not necessarily left. He's trying to figure out what's good for him and his people. But this is the real problem. And so, okay, originally you had the Labor, the Labor Party was always the ascendant party until Menachem Begin. And then you start getting the Likud, and you get all this, you know, coalition with these really, really, you know, religious and right-wing groups. So the country changed. And part of it has to do with the fact that the Sephardi and Mizrahi were badly treated. So when, oddly enough, when Begin came along, he was actually Polish. He was an Ashkenazi Jew, but somehow he appealed to those populations. And now you get a shift. Stephen. You're
just wondered how the Jewish state of Israel prevailed against all those Arab countries.
It's quite amazing. And as a matter of fact, this is something I want to point out, and then we'll go on a break. Because of the 6-Day War and the fact that so many Jews, I mean, so many Arab countries fought against Israel and somehow prevailed, gave Jews a very, very big sense of pride in this country. I mean, other places as well. But that's when it sort of coincided with Black is Beautiful and all these different groups trying to feel like, you know, we're not like a minority that deserves to be repressed and persecuted and all that. And Jews suddenly felt like, wow, you know, we're important too, and we're beautiful too. And so that's when actually the like the pronunciation of Hebrew had been Ashkenazi, and it started to shift to Sephardic, which is the way it's pronounced in Israel. That's when there was you know, an effort to actually reclaim some of the tradition that had been jettisoned. We'll talk about that during the session on Reform Judaism. But there had been a real swing to trying to copy the Protestants as much as possible, wearing robes, which is not at all a Jewish thing, and all of that, and English in the service. And little by little, it started to shift more towards tradition, and including Hebrew in the service, among other things. Okay, so let's take a break. It's 2:02, so we'll come back at 2:12. So we're back. Once again, I forgot to record during the second part of the class, so I am recreating it now. So it's just going to be me with no commentary by anybody. Okay, we left off with the aftermath of the 1967 war. And unfortunately, The Arab countries didn't stop with the war in '67. They continued to attack. So in 1973, during Yom Kippur, when the Israelis were in their synagogues and fasting for Yom Kippur, there was another surprise attack by the Arab countries, Egypt and Syria in particular. And the Israelis were really not prepared at that point. So they did win this war, but it was a very demoralizing war because of their lack of preparedness, because I think they figured maybe at some point this would all stop. At the time, the prime minister was Golda Meir, who was born in Kiev in Ukraine. She emigrated to the United States as a child, and she became a teacher. But then she emigrated to Palestine in 1921, settling on a kibbutz. She was elected prime minister of Israel in 1969. She was the world's fourth and Israel's first and only woman to hold the office of prime minister, ahead of the United States, which still hasn't had a woman president. She was described as the Iron Lady of Israeli politics. Anytime a woman is tough, she's called an Iron Lady, just like Margaret Thatcher. But she resigned as prime minister in 1974 after the Yom Kippur War. She felt that it was time for new leadership in the country at that point. So as a result of the Six-Day War and the 73 War, where Israel had prevailed against her enemies, there was terrorism, terrorist attacks all over the place. Hijacked planes, one in Entebbe, a massacre at the Olympic Games in Munich in 1972, just on and on, because the Palestinians were getting really frustrated by the fact that the Arab countries had promised them that they would create a state shortly after Israel declared themselves as an independent state. And it hadn't happened. And despite all these attacks on Israel, there was no movement forward for the Palestinians. So there were many, many attempts at creating peace between the Arabs and the Israelis, particularly between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Two-state solution, of course, was the main way that that effort was made. Now you see the picture on the left, they're kids holding big keys. And this is representative of the fact that Palestinians, many of them, still have keys that maybe were keys of their grandparents for houses that they owned or lived in before Israel became a state. And so they feel very strongly that they have the right to return to those homes. And if the homes aren't there any longer, then whatever's replaced those homes. But they certainly have a right to return to Palestine, to the Palestine that is now Israel. One of the successful efforts at creating peace between Israel and the Arab countries was the Israel-Egypt Peace Treaty in 1979. And you see here on the right is Begin, the Likudnik who became the prime minister, and Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, with Jimmy Carter, the president of the US at the time. So since Israel had taken hold of the Sinai Peninsula during the '67 war, they decided to trade land for peace. And they gave the whole peninsula back to Egypt. And the truce and the peace treaty that was signed at the time has remained in place. There has been a good relationship between those two countries ever since. Unfortunately, Anwar Sadat was assassinated as a result of agreeing to create peace with Israel. So on October 6, 1981, he was assassinated in Cairo, Egypt, and that seems to be what happens to people trying to create peace. Then under President Clinton, there was a treaty signed between, this is Shimon Peres right here, who shared the prime ministership with Yitzhak Rabin, creating a peace treaty with Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and this is under President Clinton. What happened as far as the Oslo Accords go is that there were secret negotiations in Oslo between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Up to that point, the Israelis had absolutely refused to negotiate with the Palestinians because of all the terrorist attacks that had occurred. And they considered Arafat to be a terrorist par excellence and did not want to have anything to do with him. But they were persuaded to begin some negotiations in secret in Oslo. There's a picture of Yitzhak Rabin shaking hands with Arafat. He looks quite disgusted by it, but he did it anyway. What were the Oslo Accords all about? Well, let's look at Yitzhak Rabin first. He was born in Jerusalem. He was a labor Zionist. He was appointed prime minister after the resignation of Golda Meir. He signed the Sinai Interim Agreement and ordered the Entebbe raid. That was to free the hostages that were taken by the Palestinians. He was reelected as prime minister in 1992 on a platform of embracing the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Now, this is something that seems like it would be at the top of the agenda at all times. However, in the recent elections in Israel, this has not even come up as a top point for anybody trying to become the prime minister and get votes in Israel, because somehow Israel has decided at the moment to just live with the reality of occupation in the West Bank and occasional flare-ups. Very sad. And Rabin signed several historic agreements with the Palestinian leadership as part of the Oslo Accords. He, Shimon Peres, they were rivals, but they were sharing the prime ministership, and Yasser Arafat all won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994. Rabin also signed a peace treaty with Jordan in 1994, and this is also held. They have decent relations. And because of signing these peace treaties with the Palestinians, he was assassinated in 1995 by a religious fanatic named Yigal Amir, who was considered a hero by the very religious right wing in Israel. So the Oslo Accords, Israel agreed to withdraw from Jericho and Gaza and eventually from the West Bank. 5 years of limited autonomy for Palestinians in those areas. Now, the limited autonomy is such that the West Bank was divided into 3 sections, A, B, and C. In A, Palestinians have administrative and security authority over those areas. In B, they have only administrative authority, and in C, they have neither. And unfortunately, the A and B territories are sort of islands in the midst of C. C surrounds all of the A and B territory. And C is completely controlled by Israel. And when the Palestinians want to build more housing, they have to get permission. If they want to go into Area C, they need to get permission from the Israelis. And more often than not, they do not get permission. Or if they go ahead and build anyway, their housing is torn down. So they're very limited in the areas that they control or that they can live in. And in the C area, there are more and more settlements being built. So the Oslo Accords also included an election of the Palestinian Legislative Council, the establishment of a Palestinian police force, but the question of Jerusalem was left undecided. Unfortunately, Jerusalem is claimed by both the Palestinians and the Israelis as the capital of their countries. Arafat, who had been in exile in Tunisia after being kicked out of Lebanon, returned. As I mentioned earlier, Arafat, Peres, and Rabin were awarded the Peace Prize, and Rabin was assassinated at a peace rally of all things. Now, unfortunately, despite the fact that these were really rather large concessions to the Palestinians on the part of Israel, it may not seem like a lot to the Palestinians, but this was supposed to be a phased-in autonomy, which would eventually lead to the creation of a Palestinian state. Well, Yasser Arafat was a, quote, freedom fighter. He was not someone who was really ready to settle down and lead the Palestinian Authority. He had been the head of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and now he was the head of the Palestinian Authority, which was ruling over the A and B areas. But that was really not who he was. He was a freedom fighter. So shortly after the Oslo Accords were signed, he started the Second Intifada. And I have to tell you that Israelis really felt like they were kicked in the teeth. They brought Arafat back from Tunisia. They gave him a police force. They were moving towards creation of a Palestinian state. And what did they get as a reward? But an intifada. Terrorist activities, bombings. And I think many on the Israeli left felt like there really was no one to negotiate with. And I remember being there right after the Intifada started. And I think Israelis just were giving up on the idea that it was possible to negotiate with the Palestinians. A political journalist told me at one point that the reason Netanyahu keeps getting elected over and over again is because the Israelis have been mugged by reality. Very powerful term, mugged by reality. That, yeah, we can be as, giving and open as possible, but it seems like we can never satisfy the Palestinians. Again, I'm not saying that is the correct way to interpret this, but that is how it was interpreted. The next effort at a peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis was at Camp David under President Clinton in the year 2000. And President Clinton convened a peace summit between Palestinian President Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ehud Barak. Barak offered to form a Palestinian state initially on 73% of the West Bank, and that would eventually expand to between 91 and 95% of the West Bank, as well as the entire Gaza Strip. And that was in exchange for 69 Jewish settlements, which comprise 85% of the Jewish settlers on the West Bank, would be ceded to Israel. East Jerusalem would have fallen for the most part under Israeli sovereignty, with the exception of most suburbs with heavy non-Jewish populations surrounded by areas annexed to Israel. The issue of the Palestinian right of return would be solved through significant monetary reparations. Arafat rejected this offer and did not propose a counteroffer. And I think in the mind of Israelis, this was a really good offer. And it was really, really very depressing that this was not accepted. Under President Obama, John Kerry was the Secretary of State, and he negotiated with what I thought was just a really wonderful plan as well. I was at a J Street conference when I found out the details about it. Now, J Street is an organization whose main purpose is to seek a two-state solution. And when I was at this conference, I thought, okay, you know what? This is the end of J Street because this is such a good deal that they will be out of business soon. I was quite wrong. Here are some of the provisions of the peace plan. It provided for secure and recognized international borders between Israel and a viable and contiguous Palestine, negotiated based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed equivalent swaps. So the 67 lines before the Six-Day War would be the primary border between the two countries. Since there are a number of Jewish settlements of rather large size right around Jerusalem, that would remain in Israel, but land swaps would be worked out so that Palestine would not lose any actual land. It would fulfill the vision of the UN General Assembly Resolution 181 of 2 states for 2 people, 1 Jewish and 1 Arab, with mutual recognition and full equal rights for all their respective citizens. It would provide for a just, agreed, fair, and realistic solution to the Palestinian refugee crisis and issue, with international assistance that includes compensation, options, and assistance in finding permanent homes, acknowledgement of suffering, and other measures necessary for a comprehensive resolution consistent with 2 states for 2 people. So some refugees would be able to return to their previous homes in Israel. And for others who could not return for one reason or another, there would be monetary compensation. It would provide for an agreed resolution for Jerusalem as the internationally recognized capital of the 2 states, and protect and assure freedom of access to the holy sites consistent with the established status quo. So Jerusalem would be the capital of both states, which presents some problems, obviously. But everyone would have access to the holy sites that were important to them. It would satisfy Israel's security needs and bring a full end to the occupation, while ensuring that Israel can defend itself effectively and that Palestine can provide security for its people in a sovereign and non-militarized state. So the Israelis would pull out of the West Bank, end the military occupation, but there would be some very clear provisions for security for Israel, because one of the fears is that by pulling out of the West Bank, Hamas might take over, or there might be more terrorism by people who wanted more than just the land they were getting. And so that provision was dealt with and I think taken care of in pretty satisfactory ways. End the conflict and all outstanding claims, enabling normalized relations and enhanced regional security for all, as envisaged by the Arab Peace Initiative. In addition to this, there was going to be international investment in the West Bank to the tune of $6 billion. The only real big issue that was not dealt with was the fact that Hamas was in charge of Gaza, and Hamas and the Palestinian Authority do not see eye to eye. Hamas is considered a terrorist organization by the US, by Israel. There's no guarantee that they would be satisfied with this arrangement, but it was a definite first step. Unfortunately, Netanyahu continued to build settlements in the West Bank, and Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, took Israel to the International Criminal Court. And with these 2 actions, the whole plan was dead. And there really and truly has not been any other real proposal for a 2-state solution ever since, very sadly. Today, this is the situation more or less. You have moderate Israelis who still believe in a 2-state solution, who want peace and security, as most people do. You have the Israeli right wing that absolutely does not want to give up the West Bank, which they consider to be Judea and Samaria. They believe in a 1-state rule, but that doesn't mean that the Palestinians in the West Bank have the same rights as Israelis. They feel like we can continue with the occupation and just live with whatever some of the consequences are. In the West Bank, you have Fatah, which is Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority's party. They still theoretically believe in a 2-state solution. In Gaza, you have Hamas, which never, ever will recognize Israel. So there is a big issue right there. On the Palestinian street, of course, you have the desire for peace and prosperity. Nobody wants to live with constant war and economic consequences from it. They are quite skeptical that a two-state solution is a possibility, but of course the status quo is unsustainable. Here are the demographics today. The West Bank has 2,747,000 people, 78% of which are Palestinian Arabs. There are 21% Jews who live in the various settlements. One of the problems for the right wing that believes in the West Bank as Judea and Samaria promised to them by God is, what do you do with the fact that there are all of these Palestinians living there? And eventually the demographics might very well tip towards the Palestinians as opposed to the Jews. And then what happens to the Jewish state? It's no longer a Jewish state. So what's the solution? They would like all these Palestinians to leave in one form or another. Then you have the Gaza Strip that has 1,795,000, primarily Palestinian Arabs. And in Israel, which has 8,842,000 people, the Jews make up almost 75% of the population. The Arabs, they're Arab Israelis for the most part, who have citizenship in Israel, make up a little over 20%. And then you have a small percentage of Christians, Druze, and Baha'i. Now, Israel, as you probably know, is a thriving, predominantly Western nation in the Middle East. It's a refuge for all Jews by the law of return. It's a center of art and culture. Art and culture are thriving in Israel. And it is a democracy. And of course, it has issues, as many other democracies have, including the US, minority rights being one of the most important ones. It's a startup nation. In other words, it is a place of great innovation, especially in the technological center. It's the 16th largest economy in the world. And if you remember the size of Israel, that is pretty astonishing. There's a lot of religious diversity, and as a result, a lot of religious conflict, not just between Jews and other religions, but among Jews, between secular Jews and religious Jews, between Jews who consider themselves to be Reform or conservative and Orthodox Jews, and between Orthodox Jews and ultra-Orthodox Jews. Very, very complicated place. I recommend a book called The Israelis by Donna Rosenthal, who was an LA Times reporter. This book is about 20 years old, but it's a very interesting look at all the different ethnic and religious groups in Israel. Now, Israel is one of the first nations to send aid after natural disasters to other nations. Israel Aid being one of those really important NGOs that helps people all over the world after a natural disaster. It's somewhat politically isolated. I will give you an update on that. There's always a sense of existential danger, of course, that it'll be wiped off the map, which is easy enough in terms of the size of the country, not so much in terms of the ability of the Israeli military to be triumphant, and a land of chutzpah. Chutzpah being part of why Israel has survived. You know, we're not going to take not possible for an answer. Israel has really come out of its isolation vis-a-vis the Arab world, and specifically the Sunni Arab world, because the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia are Sunni Arab countries. They are in conflict with the Shiite countries, particularly Iran. And they know that Israel is very good when it comes to security. And so for many years, they had relations with Israel, but it was all under the table until last year under President Trump, when the Abrahamic Accords were signed, whereby the Gulf states recognize Israel and establish diplomatic relations. These countries are very interested not only in partnering with Israel in the area of security, but also in the area of technological innovation and various economic projects. So this has been a real game changer in the last few years, so that Israel is no longer isolated politically in the Middle East. Interestingly enough, these countries, while recognizing Israel, have really put the Palestinian question on the back burner. I don't think they've ever cared that much about what happened to the Palestinian. It was always a convenient way to deflect attention from what was going on inside their own countries. But at this point, they haven't even brought up the Palestinian question as something that needs to be resolved in order to recognize Israel or to do economic or security work with Israel. So it's been a real game changer in the last few years. I'd like to end with Hatikva, which is the national anthem of Israel. Let's take a look at the words of Hatikva. As long as within our hearts, the Jewish soul sings, as long as forward to the east, to Zion looks the eye, our hope is not yet lost. It is 2,000 years old to be a free people in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. It's a beautiful song, and it relates specifically, of course, to Jews. So of course, if you're an Arab Israeli, this song absolutely does not speak to you, which is one of the problems with Israel being a democratic and a Jewish state. The symbols of the state, for example, the flag with the Star of David on it, national anthem, the calendar, which is a specifically Jewish calendar where things shut down, especially in Jerusalem on Shabbat, where holidays are all Jewish holidays that lead the calendar. I mean, all of these things are problematic for people who are not Jewish. So there you have it, democracy and a Jewish state. How do you balance the two? In any event, let's listen to Hatikva, and if you choose to, you may stand.
התקווה. המסדר ידגל את נשקו. דגל, שק!
Have a great week. See you next Sunday.